Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. In this episode, we're going to look at globalization and the environment. What do we mean by globalization? When economists talk about it, what they're really referring to is the integration of economic activity worldwide. Of course, there are other dimensions, cultural and so on, but the economic aspect is what we're going to be tuning in here and looking at how globalization, in that sense, in that integration of economic activity worldwide sense, impacts the quality of environment and the distribution of environmental benefits and costs. When we're talking about economic activity, we're referring not only to markets, but also to governance, because in the real world, markets and governance go together to shape how economies are structured. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to have markets without some form of governance that provides the basis for markets to function, as well as, in many places, attempting to correct some of the problems that come with the misfunctioning of markets. When we're talking about worldwide, we're talking about both the so-called global north, that is to say the advanced industrialized countries, North America, Europe, Japan, etc., and also the so-called global south, the developing countries, the less rich countries in terms of per capita income in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And these parts of the globe are being increasingly integrated in terms of their economic activity. With that integration of markets comes a phenomenon we might call the globalization of market failure. Market failure, as you may recall, involves situations where markets fail to produce efficient outcomes because of externalities, both positive and negative, that aren't counted in market prices, and because of the problems posed by public goods. International trade at market prices that don't reflect externalities allow for or exacerbate the problem of market failure. And this includes both external costs, problems of pollution that aren't incorporated in the market price of goods, and also external benefits, things that happen as a result of production activities that are beneficial, for which the producers of those activities get no benefit. External costs would include things like pollution from power plants and industrial facilities. And external benefits would include things like the conservation of the crop genetic diversity on which long-term human food security depends. When trade happens, say, between the United States and Mexico in corn, the external costs associated with U.S. corn production in terms of heavy use of agrochemicals and fossil fuels, those externalities aren't incorporated in the market price of corn. And at the same time, the external benefits that small-scale farmers in Mexico provide to the world by conserving crop genetic diversity in one of humankind's most important crops, well, those aren't counted either. And so the market fails to actually take into account both some of the costs associated with U.S. corn production, which therefore looks pretty cheap, and some of the benefits associated with Mexican corn production, which therefore looks like it's more costly than it really is when you take into account those external benefits. The problem of the globalization of market failure then brings out the need for and the reasons for what we call governance, mechanisms by which both formal governments and informal societal rules and regulations help to modify what happens in markets and indeed, again, underpin the functioning of markets. And this brings to mind something that Karl Polanyi, the economic historian, wrote about in his book, The Great Transformation, which was about the Industrial Revolution, in which he described what he called a double movement. On the one hand, you had the expansion of the market, and on the other hand, you had the expansion of what he called social protection, aimed at the conservation of man and nature. That kind of social protection is what we might call governance. Of course, governance doesn't always manage to correct market failures, and indeed sometimes governance can fail in ways that are even worse than the ways markets fail. Government and governance institutions, both formal and informal, can fail to remedy market failures, both due to problems of inability. The governance institutions aren't really competent to deal with the problem, and also due to problems of unwillingness. The political influence of those who would bear the costs of internalizing negative externalities, for example, may be pretty great compared to the influence of those who are harmed by that pollution or other environmental degradation. And as a result, the governance institutions, including the government, may be unwilling to act. And globalization can actually exacerbate both of those governance failure problems. We don't have any kind of global government, so the problems of inability are exacerbated by that simple fact. And at the same time, the willingness of governance institutions to respond to environmental problems may be diminished when those environmental problems are on the other side of the globe. So the political influence of people on whom environmental costs fall may be approximately zero when those environmental costs are falling on people far away, about whom we may not even know, and about whom our government may not really care. There are, of course, some global environmental governance institutions, both formal and informal, that attempt to deal with these problems. On the formal side, one could imagine the creation of a world environmental organization that actually attempted to deal with some of these problems. The closest thing we got to that is the United Nations Environment Program, which actually doesn't have any executive or enforcement authority. It's basically a talking shop. It's a place that people, governments share information, ideas, best practices, and so on, but it doesn't have the power to regulate anything. We have issue-specific international agreements like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Montreal Protocol, very important agreements that have addressed really big environmental problems, but those are piecemeal, and sometimes the agreements don't really manage to produce the hoped-for results, and that's especially been true in the case of the international agreement to try to combat climate change, where putting teeth into that agreement has proven to be a difficult problem. There's also possibility for formal environmental governance through the greening of international institutions, existing institutions, like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, for example. These institutions can be encouraged, and to some extent have been encouraged, to take environmental costs and benefits into account in their policy making. So those are sort of elements of the formal governance picture, and because that formal governance is so fragmentary in many ways, we've also seen a lot of informal governance efforts to try to cope with the problems that are brought about by globalization. So we have advocacy-led certification campaigns, institutions like the Forest Stewardship Council that try to certify good practices in forest management, both environmental and social practices, label the products accordingly, and develop preferential market access for producers that meet those criteria. We have the International Right to Know movement that encourages, indeed demands, that, for example, corporations that are signing mineral or oil exploitation contracts divulge the payments that they're making to the officials of the governments in the countries in which those contracts are being signed, on the grounds that the people have the right to know who's extracting their resources, who's getting paid for it, how much the country's receiving, and where the money's going. Those are examples of global environmental governance that attempt to deal with some of the problems brought about or exacerbated by globalization. So there are three questions about what's going to happen as a result of the increasing integration of economic activity worldwide to the environment. The first is, will globalization lead to a convergence in environmental quality around the world? Will every place end up with roughly the same environmental quality? Or will it lead to a polarization, with some places having great environmental quality and other places having terrible environmental quality? A second question is, if there is convergence, if we're going to end up in more or less the same place, is it going to be convergence towards better environmental quality or convergence towards worse environmental quality? Scenarios that are sometimes called harmonization upward and the race to the bottom, respectively. And the third question is, what's up and what's down anyway? If we're talking about harmonization upward or a race to the bottom, is up the global north and down the global south, or is it the other way around? And what I'm going to suggest to you actually is that there's not an axiomatic answer to that question, that in some cases up is the north and in some cases up is the south. So let's trace out a few possible scenarios associated with globalization and its impacts on the environment. The first scenario is what sometimes is called ecological modernization. It's a harmonization upward scenario where up represents the environmental standards and qualities of the global north. There are sociologists, particularly in Europe, who have somewhat optimistically predicted that this is going to be the end effect of globalization. There's going to be harmonization upward, what they call ecological modernization. So, for example, the proponents of the North American Free Trade Agreement back in the early 1990s argue that that was going to be a good thing from an environmental standpoint because Mexico would become more like us, that is to say, more like the United States, more like Canada, that NAFTA, the agreement, would lead to environmental improvements in response to rising incomes in Mexico, more foreign direct investment in Mexico, environmental agreements, and demands from Mexican civil society, that there would be this harmonization upward. A second scenario is environmental protectionism. In this case, free trade, integration of markets leads to a race to the bottom. There's convergence again, but it's convergence downwards as countries compete for competitive advantage by lowering their environmental standards and externalizing environmental costs. And this is what environmental opponents of NAFTA thought was going to happen. They thought that as a result of the free trade agreement and relatively lax environmental standards in Mexico, as they saw it, there'd be pressure on U.S. and Canadian authorities to relax environmental standards to head off the threat that firms would relocate south of the border to escape onerous environmental regulation. I call that scenario environmental protectionism because the policy implication was that we ought to have more trade barriers to protect U.S. and Canadian producers from the threat of cheaper imports from places where external costs aren't internalized as effectively. A third scenario is what could be called greening the global north. In this case, again, it's a convergence scenario and it's a harmonization upwards, but it involves not the South becoming more like the North, but instead the North becoming more like the South, where environmental conditions are actually better in the South, where the South has cleaner, greener, more sustainable production. So, for example, the development of organic farming, community-supported agriculture, the slow food movement, all these things that are sometimes called new ag in the United States and Europe can be seen in part as a greening of the global north, where we see agricultural practices that are more typical in the global south gradually becoming adopted in the global north as well. One reason to think that greening the global north might be a good idea, and that in some respects the global north is the place where environmental conditions often are worse, is that we know that per capita income in the global north is way, way above that in the global south. The richest quintile, the richest 20% of the world's countries ranked by per capita income has 67 times the income of those in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%. So it will require pretty extraordinary difference in environmental degradation per dollar for the poorest quintile to be doing anywhere near the environmental damage that's happening in that richest quintile of countries. A fourth scenario, and again, this is a convergence scenario, is what I'm calling environmental imperialism. In this case, there are transformations of production and consumption in the global south that worsen environmental conditions there, so the south becomes more like the north in terms of having lots of dirty production, industrial production, etc. So in this scenario, the starting point is cleaner and greener and more sustainable production in the global south, but that's being undermined by globalization as dirtier practices are adopted from the global north. And one example of that would be the displacement of diverse traditional crop varieties by monocultural agriculture, as for example in the erosion of traditional milpa agriculture in Mexico. Milpa is the mixed farming technique where corn is grown in combination with beans and squash and other plants on hillsides in a sustainable fashion, maintaining crop genetic diversity and some of the world's most important crops, where that's being undermined by cheap industrial corn from the United States, produced with lots of agrochemicals and subsidies as well, and produced using only a few varieties of corn, raising the problem of vulnerability to pests and epidemics. A second example would be the displacement of natural fibers by synthetic fibers. So this is a picture of sisal, as it's called in some parts of the world, a fiber used for making rope and rough fabrics. Jute would be another such fiber, grown mainly in Bangladesh, which makes burlap. And these natural fibers have been displaced over the years, really since around the time of the Vietnam War, by cheaper synthetic substitutes like polypropylene, which is a petrochemical product made by big chemical plants, involves a lot of environmental costs in its production, and unlike natural fibers, which are biodegradable when they're done with their use, they degrade, indeed they become fertilizer in effect. These synthetic substitutes are non-biodegradable, and you get the proliferation of plastic waste in land and water bodies as an environmental cost of that substitution. And gradually what's happening is that those synthetic fibers are replacing natural fibers, not only in the global north where it happened first, but now in the global south as well. Again, an example of what might be called environmental imperialism, where relatively nasty things are inflicted upon the south by the north, hence the name imperialism. A final scenario is what I'm going to call environmental polarization. Unlike the other scenarios, this one involves not convergence towards a common set of environmental conditions, be they better or worse, and be better or worse be referring to the north or the south, but instead a situation in which there are widening disparities associated with globalization, widening disparities in environmental conditions. And in this scenario, environmental costs are shifted from the global north, from the relatively powerful and rich countries, to the countries of the global south. So the global north, as a result of offshoring dirty production, gets cleaner and greener, and the global south bears more and more environmental costs. One example of that would be tropical deforestation in the global south, coupled with forest protection in the global north. So for example, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when tropical deforestation was ripping through Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia, and a lot of the tropical hardwoods being exported from there were going to Japan. Meanwhile, Japan was doing a great job of protecting its own forests. So you had a kind of polarization going on where forest protection was doing great in the north and forests were being destroyed in the south. Second example of environmental polarization would be the toxic waste trade, the international trade, where toxic wastes from advanced industrialized countries, including so-called e-waste, electronic waste, old discarded computers and things like that, get shipped on boats and dumped in poorer countries where they create environmental hazards for the local population. And that not only happens around the world, but that's, as we have talked about in another video, what neoclassical economics actually recommends should happen, as exemplified in this somewhat tongue-in-cheek memo written by Lawrence Summers, who at the time was the chief economist of the World Bank, in which he said he thought that the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and that we should face up to that. So you've got 5 different scenarios here of what could happen in the realm of environmental quality as the process of globalization proceeds and intensifies. One fairly hopeful scenario, a convergence, harmonization upward scenario, is ecological modernization. A second, much less hopeful scenario is environmental protectionism, where you have a race to the bottom and the only thing you can do to head that off is try to put a brake on the globalization of the international economy. A third possibility is the greening of the global north, harmonization upwards where environmental conditions in the global north improve as sustainable and clean and green practices from the south start to become adopted in the north. And a fourth scenario is environmental imperialism, where relatively dirty production spreads from the north to the south. All of those are convergence scenarios. And then finally, we've got the fifth polarization scenario, where conditions diverge rather than coming together. What's really going to happen? What's happening now? Well, in certain ways, I think what's happening now kind of resembles the blind man and the elephant problem. The story is that you've got a number of blind men and they encounter an elephant for the first time, and they touch different parts of the elephant. So one of them grabs the tail and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a rope," and another one grabs the side and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a wall." And another one grabs the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a hose." And another one grabs the tusk, says, "Oh, an elephant's like a sword," and so on, right? And they're all right. None of them are wrong, but none of them have the big picture. Each of them's grabbing only a part of the whole. And sometimes I think what happens in looking at globalization and the environment is folks see a particular piece of the puzzle. They see what's going on around them or what they're most concerned about. They say, this is what globalization is going to produce. It's going to produce a race to the bottom or whatever. I think the bottom line then is that we actually don't know what the overall impact of globalization on the environment is going to be. And it really depends on us. Any of these scenarios is possible. And I think what we really ought to try to make sure of is that as the world economy globalizes, as markets and governance are integrated, we strive to have upward harmonization, upward scenarios, be those the scenarios that I've called the greening of the global north or ecological modernization. Scenarios where best practices, wherever they exist, be they in the south or in the north, become generalized worldwide rather than the reverse, or rather than the world being divided into some spaces that are sacred groves and others that are sacrifice zones. Thanks very much.